Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm an e-learning evangelist with eLearning Brothers, and today we're going to be talking about creating meaningful scenarios. This webinar will be recorded, and we'll get a copy of it out to all those who have registered for this webinar. We have Misty Harding, our Instructional Design and Program Manager, with us today. Thanks, Misty, for joining us. We're glad to have you with us. As we're moving through the webinar, if you have questions, we're going to be ready to answer those questions. I'm going to try to bring them up to Misty periodically as we have time for them. So feel free to use that questions panel as often as you need it. Also, one of the things that we like to do after the webinar is try to follow up as soon as possible. Sometimes it's just to get feedback. Most of the time we want to touch base on the webinar topic and see if anybody needs one-on-one clarification about the topic after the fact. So I know you've got a lot of content here, Misty, so I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you.
I always have a lot of content, so thanks, Andrew. Well, hey, everybody, thanks for joining to talk about scenarios. The whole purpose behind what we're going to talk about today is to just kind of get honest about how sometimes as instructional designers, I guess I can say this because you guys can't speak directly into the microphone back to me, but we get a little lazy in the way that we write scenarios. And scenarios and subsequent related assessment questions or assessment-based scenario questions suffer from a lot of the same problems and usually don't end up being not only effective in really helping your stakeholders or the learners truly understand if they know the material, but not engaging and not memorable and not meaningful for learning. And so what I've prepared is some information that helps us to focus on where those trouble spots are and why that happens and what you can do instead. We have a blog series on this, so it's a 4-part blog series called The 4 C's to Meaningful Scenarios. It's been released over, I don't know, probably like the last 4 months. So we're going to cover a lot of that information today, and I'm going to field your questions, and I'm going to talk about and show some specific examples. So let's go ahead and get started. These are the 4 C's. The way that we craft our choices in a scenario is really critical. And we're going to talk very specifically about how to work with SMEs to make sure that you have the right choices. We're also going to talk about consequences, building consequences into scenarios. So in a typical scenario, you'd see, somebody makes a selection, and as an instructional designer, we're like, oh, sorry, that's not right, rather than letting someone experience the consequence of their choice. So that's what that C is about. Once they've experienced the consequence of their choice, we want them to be able to connect why they experience that type of a consequence for that type of a choice so that they can really learn from it before they then come back for the 4th C, which is to make corrections. So these are the 4 areas that we'll focus on, and through maximizing your attention in these areas, you can really enrich the experience for the learner. So this will be 4 parts to the hour that we spend together, and then I will stop at the end of each one of these and make sure to address any questions or concerns that you have. So let's start out with choices. These are the backbone of success for your scenario, regardless of its complexity. So whether you have the time or budget to have them fully experience a consequence, or even the most simple of scenarios should have really well-crafted choices. But we have what I call the timeless issue. The timeless issue is between us, and we're represented there on the left, and the learner. And I'm sure a lot of you can identify with this because we've all been learners, whether that was in elementary school or high school or college. We've all been in a position where we're going through a scenario, or we're taking a test with scenario-based questions, or and we're reading it, and we find ourselves just kind of assessing the choices by, well, that doesn't sound right. Well, that doesn't. And what happens is we end up, as a learner, trying to just use common sense and good judgment, like, oh, that doesn't sound quite right. That's where our mind goes, rather than, wait, let me apply the information from what I've just learned. What would I really do? That's what, as an instructional designer, that's what you're hoping the learner's thinking, but unfortunately they're not. They're looking at what you've crafted and they're trying to eliminate the things that are obviously wrong, or they're focusing on specific words that you've used to try to help them understand if it's right or wrong, and they're not really thinking about, well, how can I choose the answer that truly best represents what I would do? And part of that is because we created the issue when we wrote it, and that's us over there on the left. When we write scenarios, oftentimes we do it from a standpoint of not having enough information. We don't understand the context of the learner. When do they make this type of choice? Why do they make this type of choice? Why are they, what are they usually concerned about? What is, hi. Can you guys hear me? I can't hear them, so I don't know what they'll say. Andrew, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. There's a bit of a crackle coming from your headset. I think it's rubbing on your shirt.
Crackle. Just a sec. Oh, shoot. Well, I tried to take my necklace off for you, Andrew, but now it's caught in my hair. Maybe it was that it?
That sounds great.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Word to the wise, everyone. If you're going to do a webinar, just get rid of the necklace. No one needs it. Okay. All right. So back to us. So a lot of times we're lacking context. We're lacking information. And so what happens is we go to write a question or a scenario. We know what the right answer is. We scribble that out. And then we start to think, what are my distractors going to be? And what we end up doing is making stuff up. And in making stuff up, we don't realize oftentimes how obvious it truly is to the learner. So let's take an example of what that looks like. So in this particular question, and I'd like you guys to participate in this, and you tell me, you have not taken this course on time management, you know nothing about the best practices, but I'm going to bet that you can pass this question. So type your answer into the questions panel. Craig has a lot to get done today and is very stressed. In order to fit it all in, what best practice should he use? A, get absolutely everything done as fast as he can in the morning, leaving time for unexpected events in the afternoon. B, take care of the most important and time-sensitive tasks first while he has the energy, and leave the less important or flexible tasks for the afternoon. C, take the day as it comes, completing as many tasks as possible but not stressing too much. Or D, go to his boss for help. Andrew, what is our majority answer?
The majority answer is for sure B. Tons and tons of responses are saying B. There's a lot of people that are saying B is probably the right choice, but a lot of the time we end up doing C.
Yeah.
One person here says the correct answer is B, but I usually do A. So, I mean, it seems obvious that a lot of them are agreeing that the answer should be B.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you guys tacked on some of those extra comments, because they really make the point of what we're talking about here. Because as a learner, you're like, oh, I can tell what they want me to pick, even though this is what I actually do. That's the problem. Because this should be about what we actually do, so that if the rest of your scenario, remember, you're going to experience a consequence, you're going to make connections, you're going to have the opportunity to be coached, you're going to miss all of it. Because even though you do C, you're going to answer B, because you can tell that that's what the instructional designer wants from you, because the instructional designer didn't fully do their job. So so still in the discussion, the questions panel, I'd like to know why. Why did you know what the answer was? What context clues? What verbiage? What was it that clued you off to the fact that B was the right answer?
Some of the answers that are coming in, one is saying it was the longest answer, and the longest answer is usually right. Yeah. Another person said it made the most logical sense. Another person said it sounded the most positive. It had the biggest positive spin. It seemed to be worded carefully. The words absolutely everything in A ruled that one out.
Yep.
The longest answer being the correct answer is usually more well thought out. It seemed like, yeah, that's the general feel, is that it was positive, it was long, and it seemed most thought out.
Logical and thoughtful, yeah, because it's the right answer. And so in the other ones, what you're seeing is part of this kind of making stuff up that I'm talking about. And we don't realize how obvious it is when we're writing it, but it's very obvious to the learner. And we have to remember that our learners are smart. They know how to use common sense. I love that you guys too are saying it sounds like. And then you can even, well, yeah, it's the most positive, it's the longest, it's the most well thought out. So basically with kind of those four main things you guys mentioned, you can usually pass about any assessment. I took an entire semester on this on college and I thought it was fascinating. My professor had us take an assessment that wasn't even in English. It wasn't even in a real language. It was in a language, it wasn't even, and we all passed with like an 80% or above just using this type of common sense. So it's important to know, and your goal should be that unless someone truly knows the content or can truly perform the performance objective, they shouldn't really know what the answer to your question is. Your goal would be that someone coming in cold and just seeing a question or a scenario would really not know. Maybe they'd be able to eliminate one, but they wouldn't be for sure. They would truly have to have taken your course to understand what they should do or what the right answer is. That's the goal. But as long as we continue to make stuff up rather than really dig into the content behind how to write a scenario, it's never going to happen. And if we would make the commitment, so I put take the pledge, take the pledge that you won't make stuff up. And I'm going to talk about how you can get away from that. But it's making stuff up that creates this dynamic, and it's very common. We see it all the time. So let's talk about how this applies to choices. How should a choice be written? We're going to fill this in as we go, but for choices, choices should be based around common mistakes that the learner makes, the good options, so what good options do they have, and then also best choices. Thank you. So, but the question is, how do you know that? As an instructional designer who may not be close to the content, you're maybe designing something for an industry you're not even familiar with, how do you know? You've got to go get the SME. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about what questions you should ask to dig this stuff up. The other thing that we'll talk a little bit about is we really, as a watch out for this category, no trick questions, no gimmies. This is part of the making stuff up, where we'll try to trick, well, I want to make sure they're really thinking about it, so I'm going to do a trick question. No. If it's properly crafted, they will really be thinking about it, I promise. The other thing we don't want to do is have a gimme in there. So if we think back to the question we just had, where it's like, go to the boss for help, that was kind of a gimme, right? Like none of you were going to select that because it didn't at all sound right. There was no ownership. There was no, that type of stuff we'll just throw in because we need a fourth distractor. You know, and again, that's kind of laziness on our part. We've got to work harder than that. So here's how we do that. We're going to have a couple slides that talk about things that you should ask a SME. This one is just specifically around crafting choices. But when you're talking to a subject matter expert, you're going to be asking them, what do people commonly misunderstand about this topic or this line of thought or this line of decision making, and why? It's important, and we're going to go through a couple examples, so I'll illustrate what I'm talking about this. But most any course that you're going to build is because people are doing something wrong. They have a reason for that, and if you don't know what it is, you can't help. So we need to understand, what do people struggle with about this? Why do people choose to do? So for example, when you guys were saying, well, hey, B's the right answer, but I do C. As an instructional designer, I need to know why. I need to know why you do C. So that's this first one. The next one is, what contextual factors affect how people choose to handle a situation like this? Could it depend on the context that someone's making a particular choice? Because if so, that's the context that you have to set up in your STEM or in maybe your pre-story to your scenario. Also, what do people choose to do in a situation that they think is the right idea, but actually it's not? And you have to explore the whys on both sides. So why do they do it, and why do they think it's right? This is one of the most critical things that you need to understand, because unless it's a new employee, most of the people that you're creating the training for are people who kind of have some preconceived notions or have some embedded best practices that you're going to have to veer them away from. And I'm going to show you specific examples of how you can use this information to do that. What's the best way to handle a situation like this? What would be the best choice? And then give me an example of it's an okay way to handle it, but it's not the best way to handle it. That's going to be something that's valuable for you as a distractor. So that's the basic information that you should collect from a SME. But I also want to talk about a couple best practices in this category. And one of them is that you should make each choice sound like it's the best idea. And so if you can connect to this idea that no one wants to be a poor performer. I don't think there's one of you, how many people are on right now? 245. I don't think there would not be one person on this webinar that would raise their hand and say, oh yeah, I'm totally comfortable. Like I kind of aspire to be a poor performer. But we know that we have poor performers out there. Why is that? Everyone has a reason for everything that they do. And most of those reasons are well-intentioned. So in the example where you guys said, well, yeah, I usually do C, that's for a reason. And if I don't know it, I'm really missing out on crafting a meaningful scenario and helping you see why. Listen, I know that you're doing this with good intentions, and here's why they are good, and here's what you're hoping to achieve, but here's the reality of what happens when you make that choice. I can walk you through an experience like that once I understand why you're doing it. And so we have to remember that the people who aren't making the optimal choices or who are making poor choices are doing it for very good reasons. And we have to discover them so that we can capitalize on their intentions in order to be able to effectively teach. Let me give you an example. So in a scenario where somebody, so we're talking about an employee who might potentially be missing a deadline. One of the common mistakes we all make may be to work longer or harder without communicating the issue, hoping that everything's still going to work out on time. So here's an example between a poorly designed choice and a well-designed choice. A poorly designed choice might say, start working long hours to meet the deadline without communicating the potential risk. That doesn't sound right, does it? Most of you wouldn't choose that because it sounds wrong. It sounds negative. It sounds like the wrong thing to do, even though many of us do that thing. So a well-designed choice would be something like, take ownership of your project and the work required to meet the deadline, working longer hours if necessary to ensure the deadline is met. You see the change in tone here. Because what we're doing is we're connecting to the intention, which is, hey, this is my responsibility. I'm going to own it, and I'm going to go the extra mile if necessary to make sure that people can count on me. That's the motivation behind the bad practice. And when we connect to it and we write to it, and we make it sound like a good idea and sound like it's coming from a well-intentioned place, guess what? Suddenly people are like, yeah, that is what I would do. That is what I do. And I do it for a good reason because I want to be doing well. And so when someone selects that, now you've got them. I don't want to make it sound like you're trying to trap or ensnare people, but you really are. For people who have these embedded, what they think are best practices, you have to get them to admit it. And you're never going to do that with the top choice. They're never going to select that. You have to connect to their good intention and write the question that way. And then that's what you'll see. So let's do an example together. Your turn. Jershawn needs to give a highly valued team member some tough feedback. In the last month, Veronica has been late to work 5 times, 20 minutes or more each time. What strategy should Jershawn use to effectively deliver the corrective counsel? So here's the bad example, and what I'd like is for you guys to write a good one. The bad example is, try sandwiching the feedback in between some compliments about her performance to soften the blow. This choice is written around, part of the course is trying to tell people not to use the sandwiching technique. And if you're not familiar with that, the sandwiching technique is, oh, I'm going to tell you something good that you've done, then I'm going to give you some corrective counselor feedback that's negative, then I'm going to remind you that you're a great person before you go. They used to teach this as a technique, and it's come out in recent years that it's actually a poor technique because it almost conditions people that when you give them a compliment, they think something bad is coming, and so the compliment becomes less effective. So in this course, we're trying to say, hey, we know a lot of you do this, but you shouldn't. And this is the way it's written. Try sandwiching the performance in between some compliments about her performance. I'm sorry, the feedback in between some compliments about her performance to soften the blow. Again, sounds negative, no one's going to pick it. How can you rewrite this to reflect the good intentions and make it sound like a very viable choice or even the best choice? Go ahead and put that in the questions panel. Andrew, do we have anything coming through?
No responses yet. People are still trying to.
Well, I mean, I've already accused us all of being lazy, so let's give them a minute to let's give them a minute to think about it.
Okay, here's one.
I have an example too that I can share.
A few have come in now. So one is, show Veronica how she's been doing a great job and offer advice on how timeliness can make workplace relationships better.
Right.
Another one is, just tell her what you observe and ask her what she can do to fix it. That would be another possible answer, not necessarily rewording the one here on the screen. Here's one. Remind Veronica of her positive contribution last week, then discuss the difficult piece of feedback before suggesting that she correct her mistake because she is such a talented team member.
Right. I like that one. You'll notice that these sound positive. They sound like you really care about Veronica. They sound like you're being thoughtful in what you're doing. And all of that, in the way that you guys are writing this, helps it feel more like the best choice. Are there any others?
Yep, there's quite a few here. We won't be able to get to all of these. Here's one. Provide compliments, but tell her that her lateness affects team members. Another one is, begin the conversation with positive feedback before you deliver the counsel. Always end the conversation with a positive closing.
Yeah, I like that one because it almost sounds like it sounds like a best practice. Sounds like something someone would have told you, hey, this is a best practice. So, okay, that's good, and we can move on. Thanks you guys for the rewrite, but I think you get the point. The example that I had here was, start the conversation by praising Veronica for her contributions. Offer the feedback directly, but don't let the encounter end without reaffirming Veronica's value to the organization. Just because she's late doesn't mean she isn't valued, and she shouldn't leave the conversation feeling like your perception of her value has changed. Mine is a little long, as are most all things I do. So I liked some of yours that were a little bit more brief but got the same point across. Side note, and we talked about this before, one of the reasons that the best choice often is the longest is because it includes some logic in it, some validation or the reason behind doing it is often tacked on to the best choice, but it's often not tacked on to the distractors because there is no logic behind it, but you can change that. So in what we're talking about and in talking with the SMEan and in really understanding why people do what they do, you can start tacking logic on to all of them. And that's one of the keys in what makes it sound like the best choice, because everyone has a reason behind what they do. We need to know what it is, and then we can write it in, and then that helps make it more robust. Here are some other things. We talked before about how your learner is going to look to eliminate obvious choices. So here's a couple different kinds. You guys identify these right away, right? So some of them are just throw-ins, making stuff up throw-ins, where we're trying to, oh, I need another distractor, right? Tell the customer it's their problem to figure out. We just work here. No one's going to select that. It just shouldn't even be there. Negatively toned choices. Let your boss know that you've let them down and apparently you're going to need help. No one's going to choose that. It sounds negative. Always and never are giveaways too. Communicate the risk immediately. All project risks should always be communicated the minute they are discovered. Okay, well, we know that's wrong because it implies that we shouldn't use judgment, and we know that that's wrong, so we're not going to pick it. And then never give up on your part of the project. No project deadline should ever be missed. This is, again, anything that doesn't allow for a gray area of judgment sounds wrong, and so people aren't going to pick it. The other thing that I would suggest, and we talked about this before, but really try not to do anything that creates a trick question. Not only does it not have instructional value, but it can also kind of sabotage the trust between you and the learner. Once they pick up on the fact that you've got some trick questions, they're going to spend their time trying to figure that out. And so again, it shifts their minds away from what they've learned and trying to apply it, and it shifts them towards starting to nitpick your words and analyze your words. And unfortunately, if not everything you've done is super well thought out, it can cause them to miss answers to questions or scenarios when really they do know the answer, because they feel like they've got to start looking so closely, and it just starts to create problems that we don't want. Again, if your motivation is to get the learner to really think, do it through the richness of the content in the scenario. Let me stop for a minute because we're going to move on to consequences, but before we do, are there any questions that you'd like to ask about crafting meaningful choices?
I'm looking over the questions, and we'll give you guys some time to craft some questions as well. There are some overarching questions here. For example, could you use scenarios in an awareness-only e-learning course, or do you want to use scenarios in more training kind of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I can tell you that in the products we create at eLearning Brothers Custom, we have different levels of complexity of products, and a lot of our awareness type courses are what we call a level 1 course, and we do include basic scenarios in those courses. It may not always be appropriate to focus on all 4 of these C's in an awareness only course. It could, may not always, and so you might want to simplify the scenario, but you absolutely can use scenarios in those types of training. Good question.
There's another question here. Does this apply to more technical content?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm using soft skills examples in a lot of these because they're just easy for people to relate to, but we use this all across the map. So if you were doing safety, if you were doing IT, if you were doing really any topic, this can apply to. And I'll have some different examples as we go through too that hopefully will help to illustrate that. A lot of them are soft skills, again, just because it's easy to talk to the masses about.
One person says, yes, trust is incredibly important. And they go on to say, oftentimes as a test taker, there's almost a certain paranoia when taking a test. Yeah. And wondering what they're doing with the answers. By not offering those obviously the wrong choice questions, you keep the test taker focused on the content rather than being afraid of how they're answering. Yeah. That's absolutely true.
Yeah, and I think even there's a lot of overlap between testing, assessment, and the way that scenarios are written. And so I hope people don't feel like, gosh, we're not even talking about scenarios. It's just a lot of this stuff applies across the board. And even in a scenario, test anxiety is a real thing for a lot of people. And even in a scenario, people are wondering, hey, is this graded? So one of the things that can help with your scenario is to just let them know, hey, this is for your knowledge. Let's see how much you know, or you may even have to go so far as to indicate that it's not a graded item or it's not part of their quiz, because people do worry. But yeah, that trust factor is huge.
Lots of questions about where you can use scenarios, and we'll move on after this. But people want to know if you can use scenarios for language learning. They'd love examples of how to use it in a technical aspect, technical training courses, even using like Excel or Outlook or software training. So maybe you can speak to that before we move on.
Yeah. Okay. So by technical, I guess I'll use the example that was given, like software. Absolutely, you can. We have an example. We did one where we embedded a story and a scenario to set up the context for a task. So, for example, we were training people on how to use, I think it was Adobe Lightroom, to edit photos, but we embedded it within a story. And so this photographer she comes back with her pictures, and her boss, she's going to show them to the client, and her boss is like, oh, wait, look at that thing in the background. Like, you've got to take care of that first. And so they had to go and I think they watched a little video on how to do it, and then they had to go back and show that they could do it, and they had to make some decisions. You could definitely do a scenario around even like reading a spreadsheet, for example. So you could create scenarios around people who are asking questions or trying to make business decisions, and then it's like, where on the spreadsheet would you go to find that information, or what two things would you be adding together, or look at it and then decide how you would communicate it. I mean, it depends on whatever the performance objective is. I don't think, let me say this, from an e-learning perspective, I think scenarios get overused almost, where it's all we think about. Let's do some presentation and then we're going to do a scenario. Let's present some information and let's do another scenario. I don't think scenarios should be overused. I think they should be used for what they're best for. So if you're in the middle of something, whatever the course is that you're designing, and you don't think a scenario is a fit, don't use it. Use an activity. A lot of times there's identification and lists and ordering activities that are way more relevant to the performance objective. And so that's what I would say to you. Have a clear idea of what your performance objective is, and then what you're doing on the e-learning side is you're trying to, as close as you can, what I call approximate their reality through the experience they're having. If the experience is not about how to interact with another person, then a scenario, that type of scenario wouldn't be appropriate. If the performance objective is more about how to discern something or identify something, or then you can just do an activity for that. If you want to wrap it into a story, or if you want to wrap it into a scenario, you can. But I wouldn't, if it doesn't feel right, it's probably not the right thing to do, and it's okay to do a creative activity in its place. That's what I would say. Are you there, Andrew?
Yes, I am. We don't have any other questions at this time.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to consequences. So once we have crafted these scenario choices, we've set ourselves up to have a meaningful experience. But what follows is critical. And so I want to talk about cause and effect for a second. Cause and effect is a built-in, very powerful teacher. I've got this picture on here talking about the difference between, talking about just a common experience we've all had from growing up. Our brain is pre-wired to learn from mistakes, to allow us to make choices, and then to learn from those mistakes. So for example, if the baby reaches out and touches the hot stove, that's a choice. There's going to be a consequence to that, which is that the baby's going to burn their hand. That's going to create a very powerful emotion. And emotions are key, as we know, to retention of learning, which leads to behavior modification. Because we are pre-wired to learn this way, it only makes sense for us to design training this way. And that's why the consequence piece of a scenario is so critical. A lot of times, in many scenarios that you'll see in any kind of training, it's just make a choice, and I'll tell you if you're right or wrong. And we miss this a lot. We miss going down the path of showing somebody what happened because of their choice. Really great example of someone who, the government is great with this. When you think about flight simulators and a lot of the training that our military gets, they're very, very committed to showing consequences and helping people learn from mistakes in a safe environment. Because you think about a business simulation, someone's making a series of choices, and then they go out of business. They're allowed to see the plane crash. They're allowed to go out of business. If it was a surgical simulation, the patient might die on the table, and that helps them make a better and stronger connection to, I didn't do that right. That emotion helps them to remember it the next time. As designers, we're a little too quick to say right or wrong, and then to either move on or have them try again. When we design that way, we miss out on a really powerful teaching tool, which is the feeling behind success and failure. So for consequences, what we're looking at doing is illustrating the impact to the learner. We have to illustrate the impact of their choice. And that impact could include a really wide range of impacts. How is the learner affected? How's the organization affected? How are their coworkers affected? How might they be affected at home? As we do so, some of the watch-outs would be, we want to make sure that those impacts are realistic, and we also want to make sure that they're in good taste. And I'll talk more about that. So, to make sure that we can craft those experiences, realistic consequences, here's some things we might need to talk to a SME about. How would this choice impact the customer? If it is a customer impacting thing, for example. What would be the immediate effect? What would be the emotion? How might it affect their long-term loyalty? Fully explore that out. How would this choice impact the business, morale, or revenue? How would this choice impact the individual's immediate team, which could be a peer, a direct reporter, a supervisor? Overall, how would this choice impact the individual themselves? Could impact their personal life, their success at work, meeting quotas, bonuses. What's the impact of making this choice once versus making it repeatedly over time? For example, some choices have an immediate and severe consequence, like a zero-tolerance HR type of a thing, versus other things that need to add up over time before something happens, like eating cookies. That takes time. But eventually there are consequences to eating a lot of cookies. I've lived those out in my lifetime. So understanding that the consequences might be different for one choice versus repeated choices can also help you to just make sure that it's realistic. When you go to create the consequence, and I'm going to show you an example of what this looks like, you want it to feel as much like an experience as you can. So think to yourself, where would the consequence take place? And that kind of becomes the visual setting or backdrop of the consequence page in your course. Who was impacted? Is it an upset customer? Is it a super happy boss? Is it a peer who feels like they've been betrayed? Whatever that character is, and the reaction that you need to write in as the consequence, or that character who's going to deliver the emotion, who is it? Should there be multiple characters involved in showing that consequence? And then how can you, through more than just setting in words, illustrate the consequence in a way that helps the learner feel it? Because remember, that emotion is the key part. So you've got to ask yourself, like, how can I go above and beyond just the text on the page to help them feel the consequence of their choice? So let me show you an example of that. This is a customer service course written for an airline where a flight was canceled. And so now this person has a long line of customers that they have to deal with who are upset. And because we know that and we understand the context, we're able to create a visual that makes you feel like you're there. You'll notice we're even using depth. This is kind of this lady with her head that you can see here as she's the seasoned helper because it's your first day on the job, so you're kind of there side by side with her and she's helping. So the customer comes up and he's explaining his situation and he's upset and he's emotional because there's been a natural disaster. He's worried about his family. He needs to get home, but he can't because his flight was canceled. So how are you going to help him? And then right there within that same view, we give them their options. Do you want to ask your resource, Emily, what she would do? Do you want to consult the handbook? Or do you feel like you're ready to just respond? Once they make the choice to respond, this is what the consequence looks like. And the consequence comes through, it's verbal, so he's upset. And I should have played the clip for you, but he gets pretty upset. And he's like, listen, lady. It's one of my favorite clips that we've ever recorded. And then what? So we've got the visual of what his face looks like. We have the audio. We also have a customer mood meter, and all of that is reinforcing that feeling of crap, I didn't do the right thing. And then we come in and provide some coaching, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's just a very basic idea of one way that you can show or have someone experience a consequence, and just to have it feel a little bit more real, because we've been thoughtful about the environment and the visual and the audio that we're using and changing people's expression. Again, trying to approximate their reality as much as we can. Here's some best practices. This is a picture. As we were putting together some training, they asked me if they could take some pictures of me, and they said, hey, look angry. This was for a course on body language. And it's interesting because sometimes we get a little over the top as we're creating stuff, when really, most of the time when we're training, it's because we should be living in the gray somewhere. We should be helping people make the hard choices when it's like, gosh, okay, I know this is the right thing to do, but this is probably what I'm going to do because these are my motivations or these are my reasons. When we're not realistic, for example, let's say that the learner chose to turn a report in late rather than to turn it in with poor quality, and the consequence was that they got fired. That's probably a little over the top. So unless we keep it realistic, we're going to start to lose some of that trust and lose some of that realism, and it's going to lose impact. We talked a little bit about this, but we should try to show as well as tell. So don't just tell them they did the right thing. Don't just tell them what happened. Try to help show it. Try to help them feel it in the way that you craft it. It's just the same as how a screenplay is different from a book. E-learning affords us the opportunity to have experiences, to have visual, to have audio. So try to use all of that as you're designing. I would also caution you to make sure that your consequences are in good taste. If this picture upsets you, it's probably because it should. I'll give you a bad example. I was doing a course on workplace violence, and I want to say the setting was the break room, and they were trying to make a decision about, I think they were in a hostage situation, and they made the wrong choice, and so the reaction page was that this guy had a gun in their face. There's some that may argue, like, hey, that's good, it's realistic, and there's some that may argue, you know what, that's a little too far. That could be kind of a triggering thing. That could be, so you've got to use good judgment. You've got to understand your client or your organization, your learner, the context, the sensitivity of the topic as you're choosing the way in which you're going to illustrate these consequences. Sometimes, too, the amount of realism, I'll give an example of sexual harassment. We were doing something a couple years ago on sexual harassment scenarios, and the content that came in was really unnecessarily graphic, I would say. So you're just always wanting to use good judgment. How can I hit home without going further than I need to or potentially being offensive? And I want it to mirror reality, but this last one is about sometimes you've also got to watch out to make sure it doesn't too closely mirror real events or people at the organization, or even maybe what's hot in the media. Another best practice here is to remember that it's okay for the consequences to be a little less than clear if they're eventually going to find out. So you don't even have to show them right away that they failed. Sometimes the reaction from the other person could be neutral, and they're like, gosh, did I do the right thing or not? I don't know. And they make a couple more choices, and then eventually here comes the consequence. And then you can look back on the series of choices and give them feedback about how they did. We're going to go on to talk about connections, but let me just stop for a minute. Are there any questions about the consequence piece of your scenario?
I'm looking at these questions. We don't have anything new coming in about consequences. I think you've been pretty straightforward on that.
Great. Okay, well, we'll move on to connections. I'll probably do the last two C's, and then we'll stop for questions again. So another kind of big mistake that we make is that we don't provide people the opportunity to stop and reflect about what happened. And it's that reflection that helps them transfer the knowledge into long-term memory. So we need to provide it, and that's what connections are about. So connections are about what was right, what was wrong, and what it means. As we're walking a learner through that, though, we really should try to avoid giving them the right answer. We're really quick to surface that up without letting them do the work on their own. So I'll show you, I have quite a few examples in this section to show you. So here's an example. In the last one where we said, hey, it's okay to not tell them immediately, this is an example of how eventually they fail and we come in and provide the feedback, and we're pretty specific about it. Here's some examples that you can see a little bit better. So if they were, best practices, if they were right, you should tell them why. Don't just say, hey, great, good job, moving on. They need to know why they were right, because sometimes it could be a lucky guess. They don't actually know why, or they weren't sure why, or it sounded right, or, yeah, I know other people do this, and it's probably right, it's not what I do. it's important to talk about why that's right. So often we just want to say, hey, good work, good job, great choice, correct. But what we should say is something more like, hey, good choice. You could see that Tom didn't have a lot to say in reaction to that tough performance review he just received. By choosing to set a follow-up meeting, you gave him time to process his emotion and generate questions that allowed for productive discussion. You can see that Tom's demeanor today, after your follow-up, is more open and understanding, less guarded and closed off. You've taken care of his concerns before they festered and affected his performance or even caused him to leave the company. You can see that this robust feedback provides actually a lot of education about why that's a best practice, the impact that it has, and is a lot more powerful than just saying good job or good work or great work. Here's an example in a meeting effectiveness course after someone has made a choice, the reaction from the person, and then the coaching that you see here in the lighter blue box. This is kind of a more brief way to do that. So you're pointing out 3 good things that they did in their choice. In this particular choice, you didn't directly call him out for multitasking, you tried to involve him, you recognized the core issue, etc. So that's another way that's just a way that can look. This is a mock-up from a storyboard. Here's another way that it can look, going back to our airline customer service, where the person who's helping them comes in and praises them and talks about why they made the right choice and the good principles that they incorporated in that choice. If they're wrong, we should also tell them why. Frequently we don't. We just say, oh, that's not quite right. Why don't you try again? And then there's a couple different ways that you can do that. So this is an example of neutral coaching. We're going to tell them why they were wrong, but we're not going to point them towards the right answer. So here we would say, not quite. As you can see, Tom seemed quite overwhelmed and flustered. That's because you pressed him into trying to think critically during a time when he was highly emotional and defensive, perhaps even hurt. Highly emotional situations bring out the fight or flight response in people. We can't have our best conversations with them during that time. So again, good education for them here. That's neutral coaching. But you may decide, you know what, for my purposes, I need to kind of provide a hint. So a poor way to do that would be to say, not quite, this wasn't the right time. Should you consider giving him some time to process and scheduling a follow-up? We're too quick to be revealing. So a better way to do that is try to encourage them what to think about. So we could say, not quite. As you can see, Tom seemed quite overwhelmed and flustered. That's because you pressed him into trying to think critically during a time when he was likely highly emotional and defensive, perhaps even hurt. Highly emotional situations bring out the flight or fight response in people, and we can't have our best conversations with them at that time. What could you do to provide Tom the opportunity to let this process, but still have a meaningful conversation about his feelings and needs? So that gets them thinking without being so obvious. The last one is here for wrong answer is to actually provide them the right answer. It may be that you've got to move on. So in that case, you would give similar feedback, but then you would go right in. You'd say, you know what, that wasn't right because of this. But as a best practice in situations where you've delivered an especially tough or surprising performance review, you should set a follow-up appointment with the employee for a few days in the future. This gives them time to process what's been discussed and formulate their own questions and agenda items for discussion and resolution. So you can kind of just come right out. But you've taken the time to address what they chose, you've talked about why that doesn't work, and then you can move on. This is critical. This is an example of what that looks like too. So here's what could have been better. And this is just a mock-up from an e-learning course. You'll notice over there to the left, though, this is one of the most important things I could tell you about offering feedback. And this is something that you almost never see anybody do, so I'm going to share this secret with you. You'll notice on the left-hand side it says what you did well, but this person got a wrong answer. If we think back to what we talked about nobody wanting to be a poor performer, everybody has a reason for what they're doing, it is really critical that we acknowledge this. And so this is probably the most mind-blowing thing that I will tell you that we talk about today. Even when people are wrong, we have to tell them why they were right. Because if we don't, they will not learn because of the internal resistance that they have. If we don't recognize the good intention, if we don't recognize what they were trying to do, they're going to be more resistant to taking the coaching, and they're going to be more likely to just continue to do that wrong thing. So here's an example. Let's look at the better example. So actually, that's not quite right. Your choice demonstrates that you want to get Tom's concerns addressed right away and that you're very willing to answer his questions, which is spot on for your role as his manager. However, Tom just received a lot of tough feedback, and as you can see, he is feeling emotional and overwhelmed. The best practice in this case is to convey your desire to answer his questions and address his concern, but give him time to process by setting a follow-up meeting. So we've acknowledged their good intention, and then we've come in. And it's just interesting because if you guys think about a time when someone's told you that you were wrong, your first instinct is probably, but what? Because you have your reasons. There's a reason that you do that. It's worked for you in the past, or it's helped you avoid something, or even it's just a good intention. And so this type of feedback addresses the emotional feeling that the learner is having of, but, okay, we're going to acknowledge that. If you were going to say, but I'm trying to be mindful of, great, we're going to acknowledge that. That's a good intention. But even still, there's a better way to do it. And now let me tell you my side of that. And so it's almost like you're addressing an internal concern with the learner, and then you're able to build on it and come in with what you're wanting to teach them. Let's look at another example of this. So a better example down here. Actually, that's not quite right. Your response indicates that you're making an effort to stay professional by not getting emotionally involved in some of the inflammatory statements Miranda is making, and that's good. You should be professional and stay above board, even when a customer is fanning the flames of the conversation. A better way to respond, though, would be to stay professional while also acknowledging the emotional impact to the customer. Try again to fine-tune your response. This is feedback in response to, like, from a customer service perspective, people who don't want to get emotional or connect with the customer because they're going to maintain that rigid professional nature. That's not a bad intention, because there's some people that feel like when customers get difficult, oh, well, great, the gloves are off now. I can go do whatever I want. So we don't want to discourage people from, yeah, I need to remain professional. That's awesome. But on top of that, the plus to that would be you also need to still emotionally acknowledge the customer, because we acknowledge their good intention. They're going to be a little bit more willing now to hear what we're trying to add on from a best practice perspective. And so here's just another example of what that looks like. Here's what you did well, but here's what could have been better. So now why don't you go back and try again. As you're doing that, yeah, go ahead, Andrew, is there a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up these ones really quickly. So there's a great question here that says, isn't addressing the positives when they were wrong the same as sandwiching? Or how can you make this different from sandwiching?
Oh, well, and to be clear, when we were talking about sandwiching before, I wasn't necessarily talking about scenarios. I was talking about some content from an example course about delivering, well, I mean, it was about delivering feedback. It's not sandwiching because it's important for people to know why they were right about what they chose, and what it's actually doing is it's reinforcing. So, for example, let's talk about the last thing we talked about, where in a customer service scenario, someone wants to remain professional, even though the customer is being mean. I'm going to remain professional. If they choose that option and they're told they're wrong, but they're not told why, they got no validation for trying to remain professional, and they were told they were wrong, it could actually take away or reinforce to them that that's not the right thing. And so because a lot of times when someone chooses wrong, we only talk about what was wrong, we cause inadvertent damage through the message we didn't send, which was, hey, yes, you should be professional, but you can't only rely on being professional, because if you don't have the emotional side to it too, here's the impact to the customer. And so that's why I'm saying it's important to come out, because sometimes we inadvertently don't give people the reinforcement that they need for whatever their good intention is. Going back to our example about how everybody has a reason for what they do. It's good, if it's a best practice and it's a good thing, it's good to reinforce it and then add on to it, which is different than sandwiching, but I can understand why it might sound the same.
Some additional feedback along these same lines is sandwiching is deflecting or hiding, but acknowledging good intention is listening to them. It's showing that you are catching them in their positive intentions but
Yeah.
incorrect responses.
Yeah, that's a great way a much more succinct way to put what I said. Thank you very much. But yeah, that's something different that we're talking about, yes.
There was one other question here, and we can move on after this, but this person says, does the long feedback, the length of the feedback and making sure that we're acknowledging everything, does that turn the learner off? Are you ever worried about having giant blocks of text that the learner's just going to skip over and not appreciate or benefit from?
I think it's a really good concern, and I love that you called that out, because what you're calling out is my inability to be succinct. I love how even on this webinar, most of you have found shorter ways to say what I'm saying. You've noticed that a few times. So more so, don't let me give you the idea that the best practice is it has to be long. That's usually what I would probably do on most of these. Like if we went back to this, once I wrote that out, I would come back and try to figure out how to shorten it, because yeah, it could, whether it's audio or whether it's text, it could be too long. So how can you make it rich? And most of you were quite successful at being able to communicate the same thing in a shorter way. So yeah, do try to make it as short as you can. And then I think, so let's cover, there's a couple more things I wanted to talk about to make sure that we kind of round out our 4 C's. When you do illustrate impact, just make sure to talk about the meaning of that impact. To other people, to the organization, to their career, to the project. And then these are some things to consider. These are different people's perspectives or different levels of impact that you could, or things that you can look at to illustrate the impact for their choice. And then we'll just go to corrections. Corrections is really quick because it was really just allowing them to go back and try again and apply the lesson learned. And the only thing I wanted to talk about here, because it's pretty self-evident, the only thing I wanted to talk about here was to consider incenting precision. When we allow people to endlessly try again, we kind of take the ownership off of them for thinking carefully. In real life, you wouldn't want to endlessly make mistakes with your boss. You wouldn't want to endlessly screw up a process. You wouldn't want to do that. So these are some ideas, depending on whether it's appropriate or not, for how you could incent the learner to think very carefully about what they're choosing. And it usually involves having a larger construct. So for example, we could say, if you're in a scenario about interviewing, if you answer more than 2 questions poorly, you're not gonna get the job. Or maybe we have a meter, and if there's, every time they make an incorrect choice, the meter drops a little bit, and if it gets too low, they'll fail out of the scenario entirely and they'll have to start over. I've done it before where if they don't make every decision correct, maybe there's 10 decisions and they get to decision 9 and it's wrong, they fail out and have to start over because you're incenting precision or incenting mastery. This is not always appropriate, by the way, but when it is, it can be helpful. And this last one, perhaps they get 2 tries per scenario, even though there's 4 choices in a scenario. And then if they can't get it correctly, we have a consequence of some kind. So we add an additional scenario, or they have to go back and look at a section of material. These are just different options that you'll have to use your judgment about. They're not always appropriate, but it's something to think about. Is it appropriate in what I'm doing to let this person have endless tries? Or is there a way for me to make this even more meaningful by coming in with something like this that mimics reality for them, that would incent precision or mastery? Okay, and I'll stop there just for any questions, any last questions that anybody has. I know we're right at the top of the hour.
No new questions right now.
Okay. Thanks you guys so much. There's a lot that goes into creating scenarios that truly get people thinking, and so hopefully you've been able to get just a few ideas that'll help to improve the next one that you write.
Thank you so much, Misty, for this awesome webinar. So Misty works on our custom team. She's constantly making awesome custom courses. And so there's a number there on the screen you can call and get a demo of some of the other courses that Misty and her team have been building and looking at. And you might get some ideas there. And if you ever, Misty, can you explain a little bit of some of what custom offers? So they'll offer a full custom development, but they also can help other IDs with their projects. Is that right?
Yeah, we offer consulting. We offer help, really any kind of help that your organization would need on a project, no matter how big or small, the custom team can help to handle. So if you're not on the template side of the house, you can download assets to kind of help you, but if you're like, gosh, you know what, I'm not going to be able to finish this course on my own, or we have 15 of these to put out in the next 2 months, and you need an extra set of hands, you only need instructional designers, or you only need developers, or you only need graphic arts, whatever it is that you need, we can help on the custom side, as big or small as you need.
So please give them a call if you want more advice or consulting or anything like that. Misty's team is ready to help you. So give that number a call. There's also email. You can send it to info@elearningbrothers.com. And then, of course, visit elearningbrothers.com/custom solutions. Thank you so much, Misty, for your help and your presentation. We've got a lot of great positive feedback here. This has just been a great scenario course, and a lot of people are going to go read your 4Cs blog that went out a few weeks ago. So this is great.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Misty.
Okay.
And thanks
everyone.
everybody for being with us. We'll see you next time.